Thank you. Good morning. Allow me also to join my sisters in thanking Marcelo Sanchez Sorondo for organizing this very important summit, and through him, thanking His Holiness Pope Francis for hosting us and for his passion on the theme of this summit. I also thank President of the International Association of Women Judges, Susana Medina, for facilitating our participation in this summit. As my other sisters have said, human trafficking is the same all over the globe. Zambia is also a source, transit, and destination country for men, women, and children subjected to forced labor and sex trafficking. Most trafficking occurs within the country's borders and involves women and children from rural areas exploited in cities in domestic servitude or other types of forced labor in agriculture, mining, construction, small businesses such as bakeries, and forced begging. Zambian children may also be forced by Jarabo gangs engaged in illegal mining, especially on the copper belt, to load stolen copper or onto trucks in the mining towns. And worst, orphans and street children are most vulnerable. Children of affluent village families are also at risk of trafficking because sending children to the city for work is perceived to confer status. Most girl children are being withdrawn from schools by their parents or guardians and forced into marriage, often to men old enough to be their grandfathers. Zambian boys and girls are also exploited in sex trafficking by truck drivers in towns along the Zimbabwean and Mozambican borders, and by minors in the mining areas. Zambian boys are subjected to sex trafficking in Zimbabwe, and women and girls are also subjected to sex trafficking in South Africa. Families and trusted family acquaintances continue to facilitate trafficking. Women and children from neighboring countries are also exploited in forced labor or sex trafficking after their arrival in Zambia. Apparently now, nationals from South and East Asia are exploited in forced labor in bakeries and Chinese-owned mines in Zambia. Chinese traffickers bring in Chinese women and underage girls for sexual exploitation in brothels and massage parlors, especially in the capital city, Lusaka. Traffickers use front companies posing as travel agencies to lure Chinese victims and coordinate with Zambian facilitators and middlemen. The transnational labor trafficking of Southeast Asians through Zambia for forced labor in South Africa continue and is linked to criminal groups based in these countries. Zambia is also a transit point for regional trafficking of women and children, particularly from Angola and Namibia for agricultural labor, and from the Democratic Republic of the Congo to South Africa. Ethiopian men and children are occasionally trafficked to Zimbabwe and South Africa through Zambia. It has been noted, as my sisters have already said, that there is a correlation between cases involving human trafficking and other organized crimes such as document fraud, drug trafficking, tax evasion, migrant smuggling, and money laundering. And the Zambian president, speaking at the 72nd United Nations General Assembly in New York recently, accepted that the Zambian government has remained concerned that Zambia has become a source, transit, and destination for men, women, and children subjected to forced labor, modern slavery, and human trafficking. Although human trafficking is an old age practice, Zambia recorded its first case of human trafficking in 1999 when an Australian male was arrested at the Chirundu border post in the southern part of the country while trying to export 5 Zambian teenage girls to Australia for purposes of prostitution. Sadly, the man was acquitted on the ground of inadequate legal provisions. In 2004, another clear case of human trafficking occurred when a Congolese woman was caught traveling with 14 children en route to South Africa. Yet again, the laws were inadequate for prosecution. The woman was only fined 2 million kwacha for passport fraud. Many in government accepted that we needed a law that should criminalize human trafficking. And in 2005, Parliament enacted the Penal Code Amendment Act number 15 of 2005, and Section 143 of that act prohibited trafficking in children and adult persons. But even with that provision of the law, trafficking was not clearly defined. And in 2008, Parliament enacted the Anti-Human Trafficking Act. And this act defines the trafficking, but it does not define trafficking in accordance to the Palermo Protocol. And I should indicate that Zambia ratified the convention and the protocols that deal with human trafficking. I want to give you the story as an example of some 19 Ethiopians that died in June 2016 in Zambia. These 19 Ethiopians suffocated. They were being trafficked in a truck that was carrying 95 people from Tanzania into Zambia. The deaths occurred as the victims were being transported by a suspected human trafficking syndicate in Chimbe district in Luapula province. The victims were bundled in the truck, which also contained bags of beans and groundnuts. In coordination with the Zambian authorities, the 76 Ethiopians who survived, including children under the age of 18, were transferred to a protective shelter where they received the required assistance. The bodies of the 19 and the survivors were later repatriated to Ethiopia. Unfortunately, no prosecution occurred. And it is very surprising. This incident happened on the Pontifical road, which is used by Zambia to move from the Luapula province into the Copperbelt province. This Pontifical road passes through the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but it is maintained by Zambian. The two drivers were Zambian citizens, and they lived in Zambia. And it is very surprising, as I've said, that with that information, the authorities were not able to prosecute, and they simply repatriated the bodies of the deceased and the survivors. Another group of 21 Ethiopians and unaccompanied children were intercepted in central province of Zambia en route to South Africa. They were detained along with adults who were traveling with them. But due to training by the International Organization on Migration, they were delivered to safe centers, and they were later released and returned to their homes with support from this organization. A group of 40 Ethiopian minors had also been sentenced to 15 years imprisonment in the central province of Zambia for consenting to be smuggled. But after months of advocacy by this same organization and the United Nations Human Rights Commission and other partners, the Zambian president issued a presidential pardon on the 25th of May 2016, on the occasion marking Africa Freedom Day. The 14 children were released from detention and transferred to safe shelter, where they received medical and psychosocial support and counseling, and were later returned to their country of origin. Currently, the Zambian authorities are dealing yet with another case involving 70 Ethiopians who had previously entered Zambia in a suspected case of human trafficking. After they were intercepted and repatriated back to Ethiopia, they returned to Zambia in unclear circumstances. They were discovered in a house in a residential area. Since the traffickers or smugglers are not known, the authorities are saying that they are contemplating charging the victims, as I should call them, for unlawful stay and entry under the Immigration and Deportation Act. You agree with me that this does not help the fight against human trafficking. Zambia has a legislation, as I said, that deals with human trafficking. It prohibits human trafficking and several other offenses, and give penalties of between 20 years imprisonment to life imprisonment. The act also prohibits the destruction, confiscation, possession, concealment of identification documents of a victim, and an internet service provider is obliged to report to the police any site on its server that contains information relating to trafficking. Consent by a victim or proof that the victim had previously engaged in prostitution or has any other history of a sexual or criminal nature are no defenses under the Act. And where the victim is a child, it is not a defense that the parent or guardians or other person who had parental responsibilities and rights over the child consented to the act, nor is it a defense that no exploitation of the victim occurred or that the act constituting the offense is a customary practice. The act provides for a procedure for lodging a complaint and investigating human trafficking under the act. There is also provision for centers for victims, and the act also provides for forfeiture of proceeds of human trafficking, and the court can make orders that properties that were seized as a result of human trafficking are forfeited to the state. The act further provides for prevention of human trafficking, and the government is obliged to establish public awareness programs and or other measures designed to inform and educate persons at risk of becoming victims on issues relating to trafficking in persons. And they are also supposed to establish awareness programs to inform and educate victims on their rights as victims, and also legal measures in place to ensure their safety. There's also a committee on human trafficking, which has a lot of functions under the Act. And this is the committee that should deal with all cases of human trafficking in the country. But there are challenges in the implementation of the Act. There's lack of coordination between police immigration. There's a problem in distinguishing human trafficking from smuggling. There's a problem of capacity. Officers are not adequately trained, and there's lack of immigration transit status to keep victims, especially male victims, that end up being locked up in prisons. There's inadequate sensitization despite government mandate under Section 96. And there's also the high cost of border investigations. The United States Department of State has also noted the following concerns in its Trafficking in Persons Report 2017, that the Zambian government reported 23 cases from 5 provinces, but did not prosecute the people that were involved, and that the Zambian government made decreased efforts to assist victims. Officials often conflated cases of smuggling and trafficking, and of the potential victims, 11 were labor victims, but the Zambian government only referred 1 victim it identified through protective service. And an international organization, an NGO, were the ones that facilitated the repatriation of the victims. And the Zambian government has been ranked at Tier 2 wait list because Zambia has not fully implemented the international standards. We have, as the Law Development Commission, engaged in the review of the Anti-Human Trafficking Act, and there is currently a bill that is awaiting at the Ministry of Justice to be tabled before Parliament. But as my sisters before me have said, the question we should ask ourselves is, with all this legislation in place, why are we failing to combat human trafficking? Human trafficking, as I've said, is in correlation with other organized crimes. So we need to have in place organizations, cooperation, coordination between the key players so that we can combat human trafficking. And as Pope Francis has said, it seems that there's lack of recommitment in the players that are involved in the fight against human trafficking and organized crime. I thank you.